The village that outsmarted an army. The first sign of doom came not with trumpets or battle cries, but with silence. It was Marcus, the shepherd boy, who noticed it first. That autumn morning in 1643, the birds had stopped singing. The usual chatter of sparrows and the distant caw of crows had vanished, replaced by an unsettling quiet that pressed against his ears like water at depth. He stood on the hillside above the village of Valmont, his weathered hand shading his eyes as he scanned the valley below. Then he saw them, a dark ribbon of men stretched across the horizon like a wound in the earth itself. Thousands of them. The army moved with the inexorable patience of a glacier, their armor catching the pale morning sun in brief, terrible flashes. This was Colonel Richter's mercenary force, 3,000 battle-hardened soldiers fresh from the sacking of neighboring provinces, and they were heading directly toward Valmont. Marcus's sheep scattered as he ran, his legs pumping with a terror he'd never known. The village had only 400 souls. No walls, no soldiers, no weapons beyond hunting muskets and farming tools. They were going to die. By the time Marcus burst into the village square, gasping and wild-eyed, the morning market had already begun. Old women haggled over cheese. Children chased each other between the stalls. The blacksmith's hammer rang out its steady rhythm. Life, in all its stubborn normalcy, continued unaware that it had perhaps 3 hours left to exist. "Army!" Marcus screamed, doubling over, his lungs burning. "Army coming! Thousands!" The market fell silent. Then came the sound that would haunt Marcus for the rest of his long life. The collective intake of breath from 400 people realizing they were about to die. But it was Isabelle Moreau who stepped forward from the crowd, her silver hair pulled back severely, her dark eyes sharp as flint. At 73, she had survived the plague, buried 3 husbands, and outlived most of her children. She was the village's eldest, its unofficial leader, and she did not believe in wasting time on panic. "How many?" she asked, her voice cutting through the rising hysteria. 3,000, maybe more, Marcus panted. "Mercenaries. I saw their standards. It's Richter's company." A woman screamed. A man dropped to his knees and began to pray. Children started crying, sensing their parents' fear, even if they didn't understand its source. Isabel's jaw tightened. Everyone knew of Colonel Richter. He was a legend of cruelty, a man who had perfected the art of the scorched earth. His army didn't just conquer, it erased. Villages that resisted were burned to ash, their people put to the sword without regard for age or gender. Those that surrendered quickly fared only marginally better. The men were pressed into service or executed, the women violated, the children sold, and everything of value stripped away. "We could run," someone suggested weakly. "To where?" Isabel snapped. "With our elderly? Our children? They'd run us down in an hour. And then we'd die tired and scattered, instead of together. Then we surrender." This from Pierre, the baker, his face pale as his own flour. "You know what they do to villages that surrender," Isabel said quietly. "We'd beg for death before they were done with us." The silence that followed was suffocating. 400 people stood in the square, and in that moment, each of them was making peace with their own mortality. Some prayed. Some wept. Some simply stood, frozen, as if stillness might somehow make them invisible to the approaching storm. Then young Thomas, the miller's apprentice, barely 16, spoke up with the kind of reckless courage that only comes from having not yet learned proper fear. "So we fight them." The laugh that burst from the crowd was bitter, desperate. Fight? With what? Against 3,000 professional killers? But Isabel didn't laugh. She stood perfectly still, her eyes distant, and those who knew her best recognized that look. It was the expression she wore when she was solving an impossible problem, like the year she'd figured out how to save the harvest during the drought, or the time she'd negotiated peace between 2 families whose blood feud had lasted 3 generations. "Not fight," she said slowly, her voice barely above a whisper. "Outsmart. You can't outsmart an army," someone shouted. Isabel's eyes snapped into focus. And when she looked at the crowd, there was something in her gaze that sent chills down their spines. Not fear, but its opposite. A terrible, audacious hope. An army, she said, her voice growing stronger, is just 3,000 men who believe they're invincible. Men who've conquered everything they've encountered. Men who've forgotten that the mouse can terrify the lion if the mouse knows where to bite. She turned to Marcus. How long until they arrive? 3 hours. Maybe less. Then we have 3 hours to become someone else entirely. Isabel's smile was sharp as a blade. 3 hours to convince Colonel Richter that Valmont is the last place on earth he wants to be. The crowd stared at her as if she'd lost her mind. But something in her absolute certainty, in the steel of her voice, made them hesitate. This was Isabel Moreau, who had survived the unsurvivable, who had never admitted defeat in her 73 years. "Listen to me carefully," she said, and her voice carried across the square with the weight of absolute command. "We are about to do something that has never been done before. We are going to make an army of 3,000 men turn around and flee from 400 farmers, craftsmen, and children. And we are going to do it without shedding a single drop of blood." "How?" The question came from a dozen throats at once. Isabel's smile widened, and there was something almost wicked in it now. "By giving them exactly what they fear most," she said, "by becoming their nightmare." And with those words, the strangest, most desperate plan ever conceived began to take shape in the little village of Valmont. A plan so audacious, so impossibly clever, that it would echo through the centuries as proof that courage and cunning can triumph over strength and steel. The clock was ticking. 3,000 men were marching toward them, and 400 villagers were about to become something terrifying. Isabel wasted no time on explanations. She began barking orders with the precision of a battlefield general. "Marie, Catherine, gather every woman in the village. I need you in the church in 5 minutes." She whirled on the blacksmith. "Henri, take every able-bodied man to your forge. Bring every piece of metal you can find. Pots, pans, tools, everything." "But what are we?" Henri began. "Now!" Isabel's voice cracked like a whip, and the big man actually flinched before running. She turned to the children next, and her voice softened just slightly. "You little ones, I need you to do the bravest thing you've ever done. Can you be brave for me?" They nodded, wide-eyed, not understanding, but trusting the old woman who had always kept them safe. "Good. Thomas, take them to the cemetery. All of them. I'll send instructions." As the villagers scattered to their tasks, confused but galvanized by Isabel's certainty, she grabbed Marcus by the shoulder. "You know the old plague house? The one we sealed 20 years ago?" Marcus's face went pale. "The death house? We swore never to open." "Today we break that oath. Get 6 men with strong stomachs and crowbars. We're going in." Within minutes, the village had transformed into a hive of frantic, purposeful activity. In the church, Isabel faced the assembled women with grim determination. "Strip the altar cloths. Tear your bed sheets. We need white fabric as much as you can find. Then, I need you to make something that will freeze a soldier's blood." She told them what to create, and several women gasped. One crossed herself. But they set to work with trembling hands. In the forge, Henri stared at Isabel as if she'd grown a second head. "You want me to do what?" "You heard me. Hollow tubes, open at both ends. And I need them to sound like the gates of hell when wind passes through them. You have 2 hours. That's impossible." "Then do the impossible. Our lives depend on it." At the cemetery, young Thomas gathered the children around him, still unsure of what Isabel intended. When a runner arrived with her instructions, his hands shook as he read them. Then he looked at the children's innocent faces and took a deep breath. "All right, little ones, we're going to play a game. A very important game." Meanwhile, Isabel stood before the sealed door of the plague house, 6 men with her, all of them pale with dread. The building had been shut since the outbreak of 1623, when 60 villagers had died in agony, their bodies covered in black pustules, blood leaking from every orifice. The bodies had been sealed inside, and the door had been marked with the red cross of pestilence ever since. "Madame Moreau," one man whispered, "the sickness might still be in there. We could all die just from opening that door." "We're already dead if we don't," Isabel said flatly. The men worked in terrified silence, and when the door finally groaned open, the smell that emerged made two of them vomit immediately. It was the reek of decay, so old it had fermented into something beyond description, sweet and rotten and utterly wrong. Inside, in the dim light, filtering through broken shutters, they could see the shapes of what had once been people, skeletons dressed in rotting cloth, some still sitting in chairs where they died waiting for help that never came, bones scattered on the floor, and on the walls black stains where plague victims had coughed out their last breaths. "Take what we need," Isabel said, her voice steady despite the horror. "The cloth from the bodies, the bones, and scrape that black residue from the walls into jars." "Mother of God," someone whispered. "God is not here," Isabel said quietly. "Only death. And today, death is our ally." For the next 2 hours, Valmont became something out of a fever dream. The women sewed by candlelight in the church, their needles flying. Henri's forge burned white-hot as he hammered metal into impossible shapes. The children dug in the cemetery under Thomas's instruction, their small hands black with dirt. And at the plague house, 6 men performed the grimmest task any of them had ever imagined. Isabel moved between all the stations, orchestrating the chaos with the skill of a conductor leading a symphony. She checked every detail, adjusted every element, and slowly, impossibly, a picture began to emerge of what she intended. With 1 hour remaining, she called everyone to the square one final time. They came, exhausted and frightened, covered in dirt and ash and worse things. When they saw what had been prepared, many of them gasped. Some wept. Others stood in shocked silence. Before them was arrayed a tableau that would have made Satan himself hesitate. "Listen carefully," Isabel said, her voice carrying across the hushed crowd. "What we're about to do will live in your nightmares for the rest of your lives. Some of you may never forgive me for asking this of you. But if we succeed, we will all live to have those nightmares. If we fail, we die anyway." She paused, meeting the eyes of her people one by one. Colonel Richter's army has conquered dozens of villages. They've faced resistance, begging, surrender everything. But they've never faced this. An army's strength isn't just in swords and numbers, it's in morale, in the belief that they will win. Break that belief, and the strongest army becomes a fleeing mob. Pierre the baker raised his hand, his voice shaking. "But what if? What if they don't flee? What if they just get angry and attack anyway?" Isabel's smile was cold. "Then we'll already be ready to die, and we'll take as many of them with us as we can. But I don't think it will come to that. I've lived 73 years, and I've learned something about men like Richter. They conquer because it's profitable and safe. Make it unprofitable and dangerous, and they'll find easier prey." She raised her voice. "Now, to your positions. Marcus, take your place on the hill and signal when they're 5 minutes away. Everyone else, you know what to do. And remember, no matter what you see, no matter what you hear, do not break character. The moment they sense this is a trick, we're dead." The villagers dispersed to their positions, each person's heart hammering with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. Isabel remained in the square, looking up at the sky. The sun was beginning its descent. Perfect timing. In the distance, she could just make out the dust cloud of the approaching army. She closed her eyes and whispered a prayer to a God she wasn't sure existed anymore. "Please," she breathed, "let them be afraid. Let them be very, very afraid." Then she opened her eyes, straightened her spine, and walked to take her own position. The transformation was complete. Valmont was no longer a village. It was a graveyard. and the performance of a lifetime was about to begin. Colonel Heinrich Richter had seen everything war had to offer. He'd waded through blood at Leipzig, burned cities to ash, and watched men die in every conceivable way. At 42, nothing surprised him anymore. Nothing frightened him, until he crested the hill above Valmont. "Sir?" His lieutenant's voice was uncertain. "What? What is that?" Richter raised his spyglass with steady hands, but what he saw made his blood run cold. The village below was silent. Completely, utterly silent. No smoke from cooking fires. No movement in the streets. And hanging from every window, every doorway, every tree white cloths. Hundreds of them, fluttering in the wind like surrendered flags. But these weren't surrender flags. They were painted with crude black crosses, the mark of plague. "Pestilence," someone whispered behind him, and the word rippled through the ranks like poison. Richter's jaw tightened. It could be a trick. "Sir, look at the cemetery." Richter turned his spyglass toward the graveyard on the village's edge. Fresh earth, dozens of fresh graves, the soil still dark and loose. And standing among the graves, his hands trembled. Just slightly, but they trembled. Figures in white shrouds moved between the tombstones. Dozens of them, swaying and jerking with unnatural movements. Their faces, visible even from this distance, were painted white as bone with black hollows for eyes. They moved like the living dead, their arms reaching toward the sky in silent supplication. "Mother of God," his lieutenant breathed. Then the sound began. It started as a low moan, barely audible. Then it grew a wailing, keening cry that seemed to come from the earth itself. It was the sound of metal tubes Henri had created, placed strategically around the village so that wind created an ungodly chorus. But to the soldiers, it sounded like the screams of the damned. And then they saw the children. Small figures stumbled through the streets, their faces covered in black pustules, actually berries and crushed charcoal, but from a distance, horrifyingly realistic. They wandered aimlessly, some falling, others crawling. Young Thomas had coached them well. They looked like death walking. "The plague," someone shouted. "Black death. We have to leave." "Silence!" Richter roared. But his voice lacked conviction. He'd seen plague before. He'd seen entire cities die. And this looked exactly like the early stages. The marked houses, the fresh graves, the infected wandering the streets. His quartermaster rode up beside him, his face pale. "Sir, if that's plague, we can't go in there. We'd be dead within a week. The whole army would be infected." Richter's mind raced. Valmont was supposed to be easy, a quick raid for supplies before winter. But a plague village? There was nothing to gain and everything to lose. Plague didn't care about armor or numbers. It killed indiscriminately. Through his spyglass, he watched one of the white-shrouded figures in the cemetery collapse and go still. Another stood over it, raising skeletal arms, actually bones from the plague house, attached to sticks and cloth in what looked like a ritual. And there, in the village square, he saw her, an old woman dressed entirely in black, standing perfectly still among the chaos, her silver hair loose, her arms spread wide. She was looking directly at him, though he knew she couldn't possibly see him from this distance. But somehow, her gaze found him anyway. Isabelle Moreau stood in the center of her staged nightmare and smiled. She'd painted her face with the black residue from the plague house walls, old dried blood and decay that carried the smell of death itself. In her hands, she held a bundle wrapped in plague cloth, lifted toward the army like an offering, or a curse. Richter felt something he hadn't experienced in 20 years of warfare. Genuine, primal fear. "Sir, the men are getting restless," his lieutenant said urgently. "Half of them have already turned their horses around." Richter looked back at his army. 3,000 men, the most feared fighting force in the region. And they were terrified. He could see it in their faces, hear it in their voices. Soldiers who would charge into cannon fire were backing away from a silent village. Because plague was different. Plague couldn't be fought. Plague couldn't be negotiated with. Plague just killed and killed and killed until there was nothing left. "How far to the next village?" Richter asked quietly. 15 miles east, sir. Clearwater. No reports of plague there." For a long moment, Richter stared at Valmont, at the death-painted children, at the swaying figures in the cemetery, at the old woman in black who still hadn't moved. Every instinct screamed at him to leave, to find easier prey, to survive. "We're moving out," he said finally. "East to Clearwater. Leave this cursed place to rot." The order rippled through the ranks, and the relief was palpable. Within minutes, 3,000 men were turning away, some of them openly fleeing, others maintaining discipline but moving with unmistakable haste. From her position in the square, Isabel watched them go. She didn't move until the last soldier had disappeared over the horizon. Then, and only then, did she allow herself to collapse to her knees. "They're gone," she whispered. "Sweet God, they're gone." Around her, the village began to stir. The corpses in the cemetery sat up. The plague victims in the streets wiped the black makeup from their faces. The white shrouds came down from the windows, and 400 people began to laugh and cry and embrace each other with the desperate relief of those who had just cheated death itself. The celebration lasted until dawn, but Isabel Moreau didn't join it. She sat alone in the church, staring at her blackened hands still stained with the residue of death she'd used as war paint. Young Thomas found her there as the sun rose. He sat beside her in silence for a long moment before speaking. "We did it," he said softly. "I turned children into plague victims," Isabel replied, her voice hollow. "I desecrated graves. I used the dead as weapons. What kind of person does that make me?" Thomas considered this. The kind who keeps 400 people alive. The kind who outsmarts an army without spilling blood. The kind we needed. Isabel looked at him, this boy who would carry the memory of this day for the rest of his life. "Do you know what terrifies me most? It's not what we did. It's how easily we did it. How quickly we became something monstrous to survive." "But we weren't monstrous," Thomas said firmly. "We were clever. There's a difference." "Is there?" Isabel stood slowly, her joints aching. "I suppose history will decide that." She was wrong about one thing. History did more than decide, it remembered. Word of Valmont's impossible victory spread like wildfire. Other villages hearing the tale began their own preparations. Some painted plague crosses as warning. Others created elaborate deceptions. Within a year, Colonel Richter's army had disbanded, its men unwilling to face villages that might be diseased or might be clever enough to fake it convincingly. Isabel lived another 12 years, long enough to see Valmont prosper in the peace that followed. She never spoke publicly about that day, but children would sometimes catch her staring at the cemetery with an expression they couldn't quite read. Pride mixed with something darker. The plague house was sealed again. Its grim secrets returned to darkness. But every generation since has known the story, has known that their ancestors faced the impossible, and won not with strength, but with wit. Today, if you visit the village of Valmont, now a thriving town in the heart of Europe, you'll find a memorial in the square. It's a simple stone carved with an inscription that has puzzled historians for centuries. Here stood 400 souls, who became 400 ghosts, and in dying without death, found life. And beside it, a statue of an old woman with silver hair and eyes that seem to follow you. Her expression is enigmatic, part wisdom, part warning. Because Isabel Moreau's final words, spoken on her deathbed, have never been forgotten. "We proved that day that the greatest weapon isn't the sword or the gun, it's the human mind. Pushed to its absolute limit, we became monsters to remain human. We embraced death to preserve life. And we discovered that sometimes the only way to defeat evil is to become something it fears more than its own reflection." She paused, her breath rattling, and fixed her great-grandson with one final piercing look. Remember this: an army can burn your village, but it cannot burn your imagination. And imagination, properly weaponized, is the most powerful force on earth. She died with a smile on her lips, and those who were present swore they heard. Just for a moment, the distant sound of wind through metal tubes, that unearthly wailing that had sent 3,000 men running. The village that outsmarted an army became a legend. But more than that, it became a lesson that has echoed through the ages. Sometimes, the smallest mouse can terrify the mightiest lion. You just have to know where to bite. And Valmont bit straight into the heart of fear itself.